Welcome back. So the last unit test that we did was for adding no product into the shopping cart. The test name is given no product, when call add, then throw a missing product exception. We have done that. Cool. The test was written, it was read, we turned it green by writing the implementation code, a plain missing product exception derived from exception, and then we added an error message after that. Okay, it's time to write our next unit test. What should that be? Let's go back to our requirements for the shopping cart class. Alright, we're looking at the requirements, and point number 1 is that we must be able to add items into the shopping cart. We're still working on that. Point number 2 is each item represents a quantity of product. Okay, we're adding a product into our shopping cart now. Well, what we're trying to anyway. We have added the parameter for product onto our shopping cart, and now we ought to look at quantity. The product is null. We've written the unit test for that. There is no further thorn around that. But when it comes to quantity, so adding a new parameter onto our add method, as usual, we want to look at some of the thorns that go with this new parameter. So over to you now. Turn the video off when I stop talking, please, and think for 30 seconds to a minute about what kind of thorns, what kind of exceptions we might have around quantity. What might not be a valid quantity? Just have a quick think about that. I'll see you in a minute. Alright, how did that go? Did you think that quantity could be 0? That it would not be so useful to add 0 apples into our shopping cart and 0 bananas? That really wouldn't add any value. That's not normally with what we do with a shopping cart. We want to add actual values, positive values in our shopping cart. So 0 probably isn't so helpful. So why don't we write a unit test for adding 0 quantity into our shopping cart? Let's do that now. Back to Visual Studio. Alright, we're in Visual Studio, and the test, how should we write that? How about public void as usual? And I'm going to stick with the given when then type approach. So given 0 quantity when call add, then what? Well, when we have 0 quantity, really this is another error condition. It isn't overly helpful. We probably ought to go back to the client and let them know that there was a problem, that this kind of slipped through, because it's really not valid. So how about something like then throw 0 quantity exception. Let me just read that out again. Given 0 quantity, when call add, then throw 0 quantity exception. I think that looks pretty good. So as usual, we'll create a shopping cart instance. So new shopping cart. As usual, the action, we'll have to have an action again. So it's still add, and we'll make it this little lambda expression. Cart.add. Right, so what should we add in? What should the arguments be for add? Well, we actually want to have a proper product that we pass into cart. So I will create a new product. Oops, thanks. I want the exception. The ID is being too helpful. I'm just making it a plain vanilla product. This class doesn't even exist yet. That's why we've got the little squiggly line. That's fine. We will create that shortly. We do want it to be a product now, and obviously the second argument will be, or parameter here, will be a 0. Okay, good. And then as usual, add.should.throw exactly, and we're gonna call that, as we have it in the description, 0 quantity. Excellent. And we're not going to do the with message yet. This is an extension of the same unit test. We've got some problems here. We've got a couple of compilation errors. There is no product. Let's fix that. I'm going to create the product after shopping cart because it's not as important as a central shopping cart class, but I feel it's more important than the exception. So I'm going to do it in between. Public class product. Should we create anything for product? No, we shouldn't. There really isn't anything that we need on product just yet. So we'll just have it as an empty class. We can now create an instance of a new product. Great. But now add is complaining. Add is saying, now overload for method add takes 2 arguments, and that makes sense. At the moment, add only takes a product. Well, in fact, it takes an object, and the parameter name is product. We also need another parameter for the quantity. All right, let's make those changes now. Let's add a quantity. I'll make the quantity an integer. Excellent. All right, what's going on? So now add compiles over here. However, just a little bit up here in our previous unit test, add now has a compilation error. We're only providing a single argument, however we've got 2 parameters. So we will need to provide a quantity. I'll make that 3. Why 3 and not 0? I've made it 3 or any kind of valid quantity because 0 would then create some ambiguity around, well, is this a test that's testing for the null product, the missing product, or the invalid quantity? With any kind of unit test, when you write it, you want to be crystal clear as to the purpose of this unit test. And here it is that we don't have a product, but we do have a valid quantity. Therefore, I've said 3. It could have made it 1 or 5 or 9 or 1063. It doesn't really matter. I've made it 3. Any kind of positive number will do here. All right, this is great. So now looking at our unit test that we're currently creating, 0 quantity is something we want to create. So I'll do that below missing product. So the exceptions are in the correct order. Public class. The correct order being the order that we create the exceptions in. 0 quantity, exception. Brilliant. Alright, so we've got 0 quantity, which is an exception, just like missing product is an exception. We're not going to do the message just yet because, as per rule number 3, we haven't got a unit test that forces us to create the exception message. Let's go back up here and see where we're at. There are no compilation errors, so let's run our unit tests and see what happens. We've still got a problem. Given 0 quantity, yep, that test is failing, and it says expected type to be business logic 0 quantity, but found business logic missing product. So let's have a look at our add method and see what the problem is. Add takes the product and the quantity and throws a missing product. What we also want to do is we now want to throw a new 0 quantity exception. Okay, just like this. However, this previous missing product exception that's being thrown, throwing an exception is like a return value. It stops everything in its tracks. So given that this exception is being thrown here, missing product, we never reach 0 quantity. This is unreachable code. Okay, how do we fix this? We are now at the point where we really want to use a conditional for throwing the missing product exception. Stop the video and take 30 seconds to think about what kind of conditional we could introduce here. I'll see you in 30 seconds. All right, have you thought about the problem? Okay, so let's go ahead and do this. The solution is if product is equal to null, then throw a missing product. Else we throw a 0 quantity exception. We don't do a conditional for that yet because as per rule number 3 of TDD, it isn't required. Our test ought to now pass the new unit test that we've written. So let's try this out. Running the unit tests, and they all pass, which is fantastic. So we had a red test compilation error. We fixed all the compilation errors. the test was read due to a runtime error. We didn't have the production code that was required. We weren't throwing a zero quantity. And now the test is green. Let's just see whether we can refactor anything in the test code. The test code looks good, but obviously in the next step we want to add a message. However, given that we're now creating an instance of a product, or adding an instance of a product into our add method as an argument, I think as a refactor step, it would be a good idea for us to make use of our types and change the object. So we had object here, change that to product. So let me run the tests again. It should be okay, but you never know. Okay, fantastic. The unit test passed. We've done the refactor step, and we'll go back to the red step. Okay, I've got an idea. Why don't you go ahead and write the unit test, or change the unit test to add a message into our zero quantity exception. The test will turn red, then try and turn it green by changing the zero quantity exception, which means give it a message, and then see whether there's any kind of refactoring you can do. How does that sound? Okay. Why don't you take 10, 15, 20 minutes, half an hour to get this done. You've got a similar test already. So there was a test up here, you know, the given no product, which does a similar thing, which forces a message onto our missing product exception. So please, you know, stop the video now and go ahead and try and give the zero quantity exception an appropriate message. Alright, welcome back. How did that go? Did you manage to get this task done? If you did, fantastic. If you didn't, no problem. Let's go and do it together. Alright, let's change the test first. So we're at red, the step red. And the way we will force change a test, so there's no need to create a new test, we'll just change an existing test, which is this one over here, with message. What should we make the message? How about 0 is not a valid quantity? Yeah, that will do. All right, brilliant. So let's run all of our unit tests. Obviously this one should now fail, should be red. Okay, good. And the test is now red. Expect the exception message to match the equivalent of 0 is not a valid quantity, but it was something else. Okay, let's turn the test green. Just grab the message, coming down here to 0 quantity. And what we'll do what we did, you know, for missing product. So public 0 quantity, and it's the default constructor base, and we'll give that a message. Okay. So whenever we call 0 quantity at the default constructor, it's actually calling the constructor for exception with a message. And here the message is 0 is not a valid quantity. That's really cool. Let's go and see how our unit tests react. I'm running the unit tests. Excellent. This unit test now passes. We've got our 0 quantity exception with an appropriate message, and it's time for us to move on. See you shortly.